Have you ever wondered when the NBA's most resilient and positive star truly hit rock bottom? What Jimmy Butler said that night changed everything. Before we begin the story, subscribe to my channel and share the stories you like with your loved ones so we can reach more people. It was a very cold and almost freezing March night. What happened in the Miami Arena locker room that night changed not only Jimmy Butler's career, but the entire professional basketball tradition forever. Jimmy started speaking with his sweaty Miami Heat jersey still on, his eyes downcast, staring blankly as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. There was a slight tremor in his hands, not from the cold in the air, but from a fatigue that went far beyond physical exhaustion. The silence that pierced the room was broken only by the echoing footsteps on the court and the labored breathing of his teammates trying to catch their breath. But this night was truly different. To remember that moment, we have to go back 3 months, to a time when everything still seemed under control. The 2024 to 2025 season had started with the usual high expectations. At 35, Jimmy Butler was still the heart of the team. He was a leader who knew how to turn defeat into a lesson and pressure into motivation. Even after every loss, he would say, "Tomorrow is a new chance." He was also good at hiding his fatigue when he smiled, but his eyes still held the belief behind those 4 championship titles. But sometimes, true strength begins with accepting that we are not always strong. Jimmy thought about this for the first time that night in the locker room. There was a tension in the team that was becoming noticeable at the time. Derek Lawson was a young player with excellent observation skills. He had noticed that Jimmy had been arriving earlier and leaving later in recent weeks, working alone on the court for long periods of time. He seemed as if he was trying to rediscover something he thought he had lost. Marcus Tate had been his teammate for years. People said he didn't smile much on the team bus anymore. Steve Kerr also sensed a distance in Jimmy's gaze during their tactical meetings. And physiotherapist Raymond Scott whispered to the coaching staff after practice, "Guys, have you noticed? Jimmy is training as if he's trying to escape something." But no one noticed that the man who always tried to boost the morale of others was secretly falling apart. Because Jimmy Butler had learned so well to always be strong for others that he never even considered asking for help for himself. Over the past 3 months, the losses had started to pile up. That night's game against the Lakers, which they lost by 2 points, and his mediocre performance against the Celtics, accompanied by harsh comments in the media, were all piling up inside Jimmy, silently forming a huge mountain. Is he getting old? Or is this just a shadow of his former self? Headlines like these were locked away in a sealed compartment of Jimmy's subconscious. But no matter how secure the lock, these burdens quickly found their way in. Marcus Tate said in an interview weeks earlier, "Jimmy is our everything. Even in our most difficult times, we always look to him because he never wavers. He's always there for us, and he's always there." That night, Jimmy had wavered. After that humiliating 28-point loss to the Denver Nuggets, most of the fans at Miami Arena had started leaving before the 4th quarter was even over. Jimmy had only made 3 out of 17 three-point shots that night, and that statistic was etched into his mind like a hot iron. The locker room was frozen. 20 grown men looked like children who had had their toys taken away, sinking into silence after seeing their dreams slip through their fingers once again. Coach Steve Kerr was about to speak when something in Jimmy's eyes stopped him for a moment. It was definitely not anger. It was not disappointment either. What he saw was, unfortunately, surrender. "Coach," said Jimmy, his voice lower than usual and his fatigue noticeable not only physically, but also emotionally. "I want to say something to the team and ask them something. How many times in our lives do we witness the strong person we trust the most say that they can no longer do it?" Steve Kerr nodded in agreement, because he, too, felt that what was about to happen here was not just a speech, but a transformation. Jimmy slowly stood up and began to look at his teammates one by one, the giant men with whom he had experienced many victories and defeats together. He took a deep breath, and the words that came out of his mouth stopped every breath in the locker room. "I don't have the strength to go on anymore." The words hung in the air. All the sounds and breaths in the locker room disappeared in an instant. It was as if all the oxygen in the room had been sucked out. 20 grown men, warriors who had spent their lives battling on the floor of that hall, were all frozen in place. Because at that moment, those words were not just an admission of exhaustion. They were like the collapse of a wall. Jimmy's whole body was shaking. He held his face in his hands and remained like that for a while. At that moment, one of his friends who had fought alongside him for years, Marcus Tate, couldn't take it anymore and spoke in a sad voice. Jimmy. But the words dried up in his mouth like a leaf deprived of water, because the expression on Jimmy's face was neither anger nor disappointment. The expression reflected on Jimmy's face was completely different. It was as if he was experiencing a feeling of complete exhaustion. Finally, Jimmy raised his head. His face was filled with emotions that had been hidden behind masks for years. When he began to speak, his voice was thin and fragile, as if it were not him speaking but someone else. Gentlemen, you don't understand. I've always been a man who had the answers within himself. A man who knew what to say after games and even tried to rally everyone. Now I don't know anymore. Believe me, I really don't know. At that moment, all of his teammates understood. Jimmy Butler was no longer just a team captain. He was now a man who needed the unconditional support of his close friends. It was a stark reality that had been building for years in the locker room, beneath what they thought was strength, beneath the fake poses, and even the professional resilience. Do you want to know the truth, guys? Jimmy continued. Maybe some of you have noticed. I haven't been able to sleep properly for months. I wake up at 3 in the morning because all the plays I missed are replaying in my head. Renee asks me, "Are you okay?" I can only say, "I think I'm going through a rough patch." Even though I don't want to, I'm lying. Because I'm Jimmy Butler. I'm a strong man who never gives up, but I can't do it anymore. Derek Lawson felt the pain writhing inside Jimmy. Lowering his voice, he leaned forward quietly and said, "Bro, there's no need to be sad. Because we all go through times like this," he reassured the young player. But Jimmy shook his head from side to side. "No, Derek, you don't understand. I've always been the strong one, the one who never gives up. Now I'm starting to have panic attacks before games. My hands are shaking. I can barely tie my shoes. But I can't tell anyone about what I'm going through. Because if even Jimmy Butler breaks down, what will you guys do?" At that moment, everyone realized how lonely this man they admired so much really felt. Jimmy's voice was barely audible. He couldn't hold back his tears anymore. Tears were starting to burn his eyes. But he continued to speak. "Believe me, I've thought about retirement many times. Not because I don't love the game, but because I can no longer carry the burden of having to look perfect." This confession stabbed everyone in the room like a knife. His friends, who had played together for years, and his young teammates, who saw him as their idol, were now facing the truth, one by one. Jimmy fixed his eyes on a spot. "Remember about 3 weeks ago when we lost to the Suns? When I got home, I locked myself in the bathroom. Renee was crying at the door, and all I could do was try to remember how to breathe because I had forgotten how." There was a moment of silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then Steve Kerr broke the silence. "Jimmy, why didn't you share this with us?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Jimmy turned to him. His eyes seemed to be filled with years of pain, love, and helplessness all mixed together. "Because my job is to lift you up, not for you to lift me up. Ask for help. That should never be my job." These words broke everyone's hearts, because many of them felt the same way from time to time, but none of them could speak up. Jimmy bowed his head again and took a deep breath. "I stay up late at night reading comments about me on the internet. They say, 'He's not the Butler he used to be. He should retire.' Every time I miss a shot, I start to wonder if they're right. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm done." Andre Fields, one of the youngest players on the team at 22, stepped forward and said, "Bro, I can't even look at my phone after every game. I'm scared of what my family will think. Every mistake I make and every shot I miss, I feel like the weight of the world is on my shoulders." Jimmy looked at him. For the first time, they understood each other with a single glance. At that moment, a bond was formed between them. This was no longer just a locker room, but a place of rehabilitation where shared pain was shared. Raymond Scott, A physical therapist who had been working with these players for years stood up slowly and placed his hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "Don't worry, big man. We all have our secrets, and you are never alone." Jimmy looked at him with astonished eyes, because such an honest confession and such an open conversation had never happened between them before. Jeremiah Banks interrupted. "Do you think you're the only one reading the comments at 3 a.m.? I read them too, knowingly and willingly, even though I know it hurts me, because I need to feel something, but I can't take it anymore." With these words, the thick walls of the locker room began to crack one by one. As Jeremiah Banks's voice grew louder, a deafening silence fell over the room. It was as if everyone's mind was echoing the same thing. Me too, and me too. I'm fragile." Jimmy closed his eyes. These confessions were removing some of the pressure inside him. He was beginning to realize that he was not alone, but this was only the beginning. Suddenly, someone else in the room made a confession. Derek Lawson spoke almost in a whisper. "Do you know that I take sleeping pills almost every night to be able to sleep? I can't stop my mind. I relive every position over and over again. I constantly think about my mistakes. Every moment I let the team down is replayed in my mind." Jimmy looked at him. He saw exhaustion in the eyes of this young, hopeful player. It reminded him of his own youth. Of course, this made him feel even more like he was on fire. Then Andre Fields stepped forward. "I don't even turn on my phone after the game. Not because of my teammates, but because I'm ashamed of my family. When my dad says, 'Good job, son,' I think he's lying. I'm only 22, but I feel way older than my age, like I'm carrying the entire weight of the NBA on my shoulders." Each sentence opened another wound, but at the same time, it was like applying ointment to a wound. For the first time in this locker room, something was facing reality and coming out. Steve Kerr had been silent until now, but now he couldn't stop himself from taking a deep breath, bowing his head, and saying, "Guys, I have to confess something to you. For years I thought I was instilling the wrong culture in you. I said, 'Be strong, no tears, and no feelings,' because that's how I was taught. But now I realize I was wrong." His eyes were filled with tears. No player had ever seen Steve Kerr like this before. "I've been battling depression for 15 years. Some mornings I can't even get out of bed. But I'm a coach. I want you to be safe, so I smile and stand tall. I act like everything is fine." Jimmy took a deep breath. For the first time, he realized that the man he had looked up to as a leader for so many years was also vulnerable. And this realization that he wasn't alone shook Jimmy to his core. At that moment, these two giants who had fought alongside each other for years saw what was inside each other for the first time. Jimmy raised his head. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, but this time they weren't from pain. It was a kind of release. "Do you know what the craziest thing is?" he said with a smile, his voice mixed with tears. "Guys, we've all been suffering alone. We've always hidden it to protect each other. But if we had shared these feelings together, maybe we wouldn't be so tired and broken." At that moment, a change had already begun in the room. They were no longer warriors, but friends whose masks had fallen away. Raymond Scott approached. He touched Jimmy's shoulder again. "Jimmy, do you know what I respect most about you? It's that you always get back up when you fall. But tonight, I respect you more than ever, because you admitted that you fell." Jimmy's gaze finally began to clear of the weight that had been weighing him down. A sentence slipped from his lips. "So what do we do now?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't just a question about the future, but about life itself. It was a turning point. In that moment, a leader was reborn. But this time, he drew his strength not from a false armor, but from reality. Steve Kerr stood up. He looked at each of his players one by one. His voice trembled, but he spoke with clear determination. 1. We are done acting like machines. 2. We are getting professional help. 3. This is no longer a locker room. This is now our safest place. The only place where being human is not something to be ashamed of. At that moment, everyone felt that this night was not just for the team, but perhaps the beginning of a cultural transformation in NBA history. Raymond Scott took out his phone and said, "I know someone. Dr. Alana Reyes. She works with Olympic athletes. She won't see us as broken people. She'll understand us." Jimmy felt something change inside him. One of the heavy chains in his head had finally broken. That night, all the walls came down, but something was rising from the rubble. A team healing together. From that moment on, nothing was the same. In the locker room, it wasn't just strategy that was being discussed. It was emotions. Before shooting percentages, it was heart rates that mattered, and before the scoreboard, it was tears that were noticed. A week later, Dr. Alana Reyes stepped into the Miami arena for the first time. She had an elegant but powerful presence. She had worked with Olympic athletes and understood pressure, not only academically, but also on a human level. They all sat together at the first meeting: Jimmy, Marcus, Andre, Derek, and Jeremiah. None of them sat in their chairs like giant warriors, but like human beings. Dr. Reyes took a deep breath. Then she looked each of them in the eye and said, "Elite athletes experience much more anxiety and depression than the general population. This is very common, but they are also the last to ask for help, because the image of strength is their most important armor." This sentence pierced Jimmy's heart like an arrow, because he too had carried that armor for years. And now, it had formed a hump on his back. Dr. Reyes continued, "Mental health requires as much attention as physical conditioning. It's as important as kicking a ball and passing it. Starting today, mental health sessions will be part of your training program, not with punishment, but with awareness, not with complacency, but with compassion." The first session was silent. It wasn't easy to confess, but then Jimmy spoke. "For the first time, I don't feel like I need to fake a smile after the game. I missed that feeling." And another chain broke. With that chain, Marcus spoke. "When I was little, they made fun of me for crying. Now I'm 33 and I still carry that shame. But that night I saw you crying, Jimmy, and I felt relieved." Andre added, "I didn't cry when I got home that night, because I wasn't hiding what was inside me anymore. The things I had been holding inside came out, and it was very liberating." Jimmy closed his eyes. Those words were almost as valuable to him as a championship ring. Days passed. Weeks went by. But something had changed. In training, he focused not only on physical strength, but also on psychological strength. Meetings were not just about tactics, but also about emotions. And the team that took to the field was much faster, sharper, and more peaceful than before. Jimmy no longer had trouble breathing when he woke up in the morning. He was now sleeping less than 8 hours a night. One day, when he gave an interview in the media room after practice, the reporters took notes in amazement. "No, the problems aren't over, but I'm not hiding them anymore. I'm facing them, and that's what made me love playing again." The Miami Heat was on the rise again. But this wasn't just a statistical rise. It was also a journey of healing for the soul. There was a smiling Jimmy at press conferences now, but this time, his smile wasn't on his face. It was coming from within. And one day, in another interview, when Jimmy Butler was asked about the proudest moment of his career, he answered without hesitation, "The proudest moment? Not the championship night. It was that night, in the locker room, when I said, 'I can't take it anymore,' because that moment saved me from all my anxiety." The journalists fell silent, because that sentence wasn't meant to be written on paper. It was meant to be engraved in the heart. This change caught the attention of not just Jimmy, but the entire NBA. Players who were once rivals found courage in Jimmy's bravery. Kevin Durant spoke about his social anxiety. LeBron James revealed for the first time that he has been in therapy for years. Giannis Antetokounmpo shared how he was crushed by the pressure of providing for his family. Jimmy's words, "I can't do this anymore," sparked the biggest cultural shift in the NBA, and no one used the word power in the same way anymore, because they had learned that true strength is not denying that you are broken, but admitting that you are broken and healing. That night, the fragile voice that rose from the locker room broke not only the chains inside Jimmy, but also the culture of silence that had prevailed throughout the NBA for years. And this wave of change was not limited to the Miami Heat. Steve Kerr launched the league's first comprehensive mental health support program after that transformative night. Mental well-being was now as much an official part of the game as physical endurance. Every team, every coach, Every player slowly began to face the same question. What have we been suppressing all this time? Led by Jimmy Butler, the Miami Heat wasn't just playing basketball. It was changing a culture. 3 months later, Miami won one of the most crucial games of the season. There were celebrations in the locker room after the game, but this time, there were no shouts, only genuine laughter. Andre Fields shared how therapy changed not only his game, but also his relationship with his family. Derek Lawson said he can now forgive himself for every mistake he makes. Marcus Tate said he rediscovered the joy of the game without the burden of the past. And Jimmy Butler, when he was silent, there was no silence inside him anymore. There was a calmness that came from being at peace with himself. When he was a guest on a podcast, the host asked him what the greatest words of his career were. Jimmy answered without hesitation, "I don't think the most important thing I've ever said in my career was, 'We're champions.' It was, 'I can't do this,' because those words saved me. They saved my team. Maybe they'll save others too." The host's voice caught in his throat. At that moment, thousands of listeners froze in front of their screens. Because at that moment, it became clear that true heroism was not in shooting three-pointers, but in facing yourself. When the season ended, the Miami Heat had not only made the playoffs, they had turned the game into a kind of therapy and victory into a kind of healing. There were no superheroes on the court anymore. There were people, and that's why they were even stronger. Jeremiah Banks told a reporter, "We used to forget that we were human. Now we play better because we are human." Jimmy Butler was sitting on the sidelines with the younger players after the game when he suddenly smiled. It was a genuine, heartfelt, pure smile. He was finally able to carry the expression he had worn on his face for years, but which had never been genuine, with a sense of inner peace. And he asked, "Did you notice? Even after winning, there's a real us here now. We're happy not just because we won, but because we grew up together." These words echoed across the locker room, because no one was alone anymore. Jimmy Butler's greatest victory was not a championship, but a confession. On the day he said, "I can't do it," he showed the world what true leadership is. And perhaps the real championship lies in the heart that can say, "Help me," on the hardest night. Have you ever felt like you had to look strong? Subscribe and write, "I stayed silent too," in the comments to break this silence together. Because sometimes the greatest courage begins with asking for help.